Hello and welcome to, on behalf of the Gulf International Forum, uh, to a fascinating and what I hope will be instructive discussion today on Biden and the GCC. Is it a new start or is it more of the same? During his presidential campaign and thereafter, President Joe Biden called for a reset in U.S. relations with the GCC and the surrounding region. It appears that the administration contemplates moving away from the existing transactional relationship based on oil, arms sales, and shared hostility towards Iran. Biden and his administration have signaled that American objectives will concentrate towards a greater emphasis on diplomacy in support of human rights and in pursuit of reducing regional tensions. Uh, he confronts a changed landscape. Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, the Obama administration's signature Gulf policy. Biden has indicated that he wishes to rejoin. Despite 6 years of an intervention in Yemen, supported by both the United States and the United Kingdom, the Houthis, supported by the Iranians, seem to have stayed on the offensive, while the humanitarian crisis has only worsened and the country is threatened with partition. Trump's maximum pressure campaign caused great harm to the Iranian economy, but failed to compel any changes in that country's activity. Today, we're going to ask what are the principles behind Biden's policy in the Gulf with Washington's Arab partners? Can we make the US-GCC partnership more fruitful in accomplishing not just American interests, but also the interests of the regional countries? Today, I'll briefly run through our speakers in their order. You have before you their biographies on the website. Dr. Danya Dhafar, our Executive Director at the Gulf International Forum, and currently an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, will give us an overview of the American relationship with the Gulf states as a whole and the directions President Biden has signaled he will take. Our second speaker, Ambassador Susan Ziadi, knows the GCC very well. Prior to serving as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs with responsibility for the Arabian Peninsula, served as ambassador to Qatar. She will address potential changes in U.S. policy for the Gulf as a whole, but with special emphasis on Saudi Arabia and Qatar, respectively the largest and smallest GCC states. We are honored by our third speaker, Dr. Hisham Alghannam, a Saudi political scientist, a respected and well-published expert of the region, currently also with the Gulf Research Center at Cambridge. He will share his insights into how Riyadh views the Biden administration's announced foreign policy towards Saudi Arabia and what that might imply for the future. Our cleanup speaker, our fourth speaker, Dr. Stephen Cook, the Enrico Mattei Scholar for Middle East and Africa Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, a well-respected and frequently published scholar and expert of the region, and an old friend. He will look at the American perspective on the direction the relationship with the GCC and especially Saudi Arabia will take under the new Biden administration. Questions, there are instructions on how questions may be posed, and I will try and elicit the best answers to those questions when we get to that phase. In the meantime, thank you, Dr. Dhafar.
Okay. So I will give a broad overview of how I see the role of the US in the Gulf region is evolving or kind of remaining the same, actually. As most of us already probably know, especially in Washington, that there has been some soul searching about the role of the US in the Middle East. And there's discussions about retrenchment, reduction of forces, or complete withdrawal. And these discussions in the policy-making community has been going on really in the last decade, since Obama came into office. And from a bird's eye overview, whether there is a Trump administration or a Biden administration, I would argue that the US has been, in the last decade, and will continue under the Biden administration to kind of walk this fine line that hasn't really displayed retrenchment or full or interventionism in the Gulf region. A drawdown of the U.S. in the region has been really a bipartisan policy, but it is debatable, how that would look. The GCC states have realized this and caught on to this, and it has caused them to respond by taking more leadership in regional affairs. And I kind of want to ask, how does this affect the Biden administration? And I pretty much foresee much of the same at the grand kind of strategic level, if you will. There are slight changes, but important ones when we look at the classic national security considerations in the last decade that have contributed to U.S. disengagement and the power vacuum in the region. Energy security has decreased in importance. There's a strong sense of war wariness among Americans, which have been caused by the Afghanistan war or the war in Iraq. Terrorism for the Middle East is becoming less of an imminent national security threat. However, regardless of these changes in priorities, it's still undeniable that non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, countering violent extremism, and ensuring no disruption in the oil markets or waterways remain linchpins for U.S. security interests in the Gulf. So I'm going to go on a very slight tangent. And my personal perspective is that this traditional assessment of national security is dated and somewhat imposed by the military logic of the Cold War. While certainly these strategic interests remain important, there needs to be a more holistic focus on human security. Myopically focusing on military security really masks underlying issues of political, economical, societal, and environmental threats. And presumably, if the US is looking to deal with root causes, then national security interests need to be redefined or at least reassessed. And if we continue with the same logic and the same input, namely defined, the aforementioned defined national security interests, yet expect a different output, I think that's kind of a losing strategy. Now, let me get back into my topic here, but I wanted to make that point. One salient trend that stands out when reviewing the changes in U.S. priorities as it pertains to the Gulf is that the U.S. approach has changed over the last decade. So when evaluating the national military strategy, which are all important, these are all important documents, strategic documents for the U.S., the national security strategy and the national defense strategy, from 2010 forward, there's a less explicit emphasis on the GCC states. And when they're discussed in the most recent versions, the reports generally say working with partners to manage their security and an emphasis on more resource sustainable approach. So the change in tone communicated in strategic documents, coupled with the circulation of new approaches to security cooperation, are really all signs that the U.S. role in the global leadership is evolving, including the Gulf region. And signs of these policies being placed into action can be witnessed both under Obama, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and will most likely witness them under the Biden administration as well. So talking from a broad perspective of resetting US-GCC relations and looking at the transition from Biden to Trump, since the end of the Cold War, I think generally Democratic and Republican administrations alike have pursued this grand strategy, if you will, often coined as kind of liberal hegemony, which is originally coined by Barry Pazin, if you read IR theory and whatnot. And there are two components to this conception of grand strategy. So one, it is hegemonic in the sense that the US aims to be the most powerful state in the world. And arguably, I think it is by a wide margin still. And two, it was liberal in the sense that the United States sought to transform the international system into this rule-based order regulated by multilateral institution. Now, under the Trump era, he's kind of ushered this new strategy by disposing the liberal element, and has kind of named it as illiberal hegemony. And what distinguishes Trump for Biden is that Trump removed this liberal aspect. So, we've seen President Trump express that he wanted to maintain the U.S. as a superior economic and military leader in the Gulf region and the world. However, he's really has foregone the exportation of values and has both abstained and withdrawn from multilateral agreements. And we saw that many examples with Trump, President Trump. And all of these elements feed into his Gulf policy and how Biden arguably views the resetting of relations. And this is kind of a hot topic that we've seen ongoing in the headlines. So Biden prefers really to work with allies multilaterally, and he views traditional transatlantic allies to kind of be his core focus, and looking at working through different various global institutions. Now, with regards to policies in the Middle East, akin to the US's traditional foreign policy, both Biden and Trump really categorically agree Israel is a key ally, and they will welcome any Arab state's normalization with Israel with open arms. Although they differ in their stances to a two-state solution, but that's a whole nother debate. Both presidents deviate on three critical approaches to the GCC states, and this is where I think the resetting of relations lie in the Biden administration. So Saudi Arabia and the other GCC states will not have a direct line with the White House as they did once with Trump. And Saudi has been really a paradox for any American administration's foreign policy team. On the one hand, the U.S. has important, aforementioned strategic interest vested in the kingdom, yet it often collides with what would be typified as American values. And so we see that kind of translating in some of the policy variation going on between Biden and Trump. As we know, Trump supported the war in Yemen. Biden currently doesn't. Trump and Biden both aspire to check Iran as a nuclear power, yet they have completely different strategies, although Biden has extended some of Trump's approaches. Regardless of bipartisan differences, the U.S. has really had a steady and consistent grand strategy as it approached the Gulf region. Obama's disengagement from Iraq is an example, and the U.S.'s tepid responses to attacks from Iran are all signals that the U.S. has changed its role in the region in the last decade. And so there has been debates on whether U.S. presence in the region is of a cyclical pattern of engagement or one of gradual withdrawal. Really, the fact is that the Gulf does remain the backbone of U.S. security architecture in the Middle East. There's still an extensive basing infrastructure there. And so in sum, I would argue that the U.S. will continue to remain the primary security guarantor. There's really no other viable alternatives at this point. We will see more of the same with the Biden administration as it pertains to big picture strategic questions to Gulf policy. There will be, the continuation of the strategy of restraint and the backing of this liberal hegemonic approach, resetting the illiberal component from the Trump administration. Basically, institutional inertia will limit President Biden to a recalibration in relation to with GCC partners rather than a rupture, especially when we're talking about Saudi Arabia. The U.S. will continue to work with partners on their security and continue to emphasize on more resource sustainable approaches through collaboration. Now, in terms of the US's evolving role, since the Arab Spring, the Middle East has been largely in a state of anarchy in many regards, and the GCC states have attempted to fill these security vacuums by developing new alliances and security arrangements, along with getting involved with in various regional conflicts. And these factors have really caused the GCC states to have more of a prominent role in regional politics. And one new challenge in dealing with the GCC that I think President Biden will face is asserting power when regional actors have taken a more active role and assertive role that sometimes directly challenges US interest. And as the Biden administration evaluates how to address the various conflicts across the Middle East, the GCC states, including Saudi Arabia, are critical to resolving these regional conflicts. So there are challenges for Biden when it comes to dealing with the GCC states that kind of limit his ability to deal with issues of the region as he probably would have perhaps preferred to deal with them. Thank you.
Dr. Thaffer, thank you so much. You did make one point with which I wholeheartedly agree, and I think many of my former colleagues would as well, is that we have allowed one aspect of U.S. foreign policy to become only the military aspect of U.S. foreign policy to become dominant, and we do need to look at things holistically. And on that note, Ambassador Ziadi, things have changed since you and I were running around the Gulf.
Indeed. Thank you so much for this kind invitation. I would like to build a little bit on the comment that Dr. Thaffer so eloquently laid out. Maybe just drill down on a few of them. I think in terms of the Biden administration, the overall posture towards the region will continue, and certainly not disengagement, but as she so astutely noted, there will be a shift. Some of the traditional issues that guide our policy, I believe, are still there. That of promoting stability, regional security, encouraging regional cooperation, for example, in the case of naval cooperation, preventing piracy, preventing a safe maritime environment for the free flow of trade and energy. I believe these still remain. But again, there are additional issues that the Biden administration has articulated. Many of them are transnational and actually global issues, such as climate change, health issues. Certainly we see this in the COVID era, but actually other issues have emanated from the region in earlier versions of SARS, as we know, and certainly a greater focus on human rights. One issue that I think will concern the Biden administration is a greater emphasis on great power competition and a rising China. They've articulated that. But also, what does it mean in terms of the greater Chinese geo-economic and commercial expansion in the region, and how that is a competitor to US interests? And on the case of Russia, what is the greater influence with GCC countries in shaping energy production, pricing, supply, and especially with Saudi Arabia on oil, where this is a big issue, and with Qatar specifically on natural gas. As has been stated, and I want to reiterate, I do believe that the Biden administration will seek to reduce military solutions as the only way forward, and certainly will seek to address issues more diplomatically and through other aspects of diplomacy multilaterally. But I think we as an administration, the Biden administration, although I'm not part of that anymore, but many of my colleagues continue to serve in that, will look to the GCC countries for more participation in regional security requirements. what I would call burden sharing in the broadest sense, not simply financially. It's no longer an issue of just throw money at it and it will go away, but also on their military personnel that are deployed. Joint training, even GCC-wide. I would note that even during the days of the Gulf Rift, we as the US military still insisted that all countries of the GCC participate in the regional security training. We have GCC navies that are participating in the combined task force under patrolling the waters in this AOR under NAVCENT control. I saw recently mention on March 16th of a Qatar-US-French joint exercise, which was done at El Udeid, and the Air Wing commander there stated very clearly in the press release, we hope this partnership leads to Qatar taking a larger role in the collective defense of the Arabian Gulf. So it's very clear that not only in our posture and in our training, in our joint exercises, but in our public affairs, we are stating very clearly our expectations of greater burden sharing in the region. One interesting item that I would also note is the incorporation of Israel into the CENTCOM area of responsibility of AOR. It's long been considered, it has always been a bit difficult when Israel was under EUCOM, the European Command, but now it's deemed more timely with the normalization of two GCC countries, the UAE and Bahrain. And interestingly enough, on March 7th, there was a press release from the US about a US B-52 bomber that flew to the Persian Gulf. And it was escorted by the air forces from Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar in their respective airspace. Now, while this wasn't a joint operation by any means, it was still the first time that Israel played a role in an operation in the region with other GCC countries participating, albeit in their own airspace. So it's a first baby step, but a first step to looking at how Israel and the Israeli military element will be incorporated into the AOR. So I'd like to turn briefly to Iran. I know others will address this more fully, but just the fact that now we see Secretary Blinken in Brussels yesterday meeting with the members of the European members, the UK, Germany, and France, looking at the issue of Iran and how to move forward as the P5+1. Obviously, it's unclear how Tehran will respond. So far, we know that the hardliners seem to be ascendant. The Iranian elections are taking place in June for the presidency. Secretary Blinken has called for Iran's compliance with the agreement, and the special envoy for Iran, Rob Malley, has indicated that discussions are not linked to the timeline for the Iran's presidential elections, but it's unclear as to who will blink first. And certainly the GCC interests have been loudly stated. I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the time when some of these negotiations were taking place, and the GCC ambassadors in Washington were very clear in their in the fact that they were upset that they were not being included and wanting to know exactly what was the state of play. And I will say that we as an administration then under Obama did brief them on a regular basis as to what was taking place. But that won't suffice this time. And what will be the GCC's reaction in terms of what mechanism will be used to factor in their concerns? But it's clear that they will have to have some kind of input. And then, of course, how does the Biden administration now factor in these new considerations in a revised JCPOA? They were considerations in the past, but didn't seem to be able to be factored into an agreement. And namely, we're focusing on the status and the size of the Iranian ballistic missile defense system, the sunset clauses on previous agreements, and certainly a focus on Iran's expanding interventionist behavior in the region. These are topics that The Biden administration has indicated that they will take on in negotiations if negotiations are to go forward. Will it take place in the beginning? Will it be an add-on, a part one, a part two? All of this is unclear yet, as the administration is starting to find its footing and decide how to go forward. But it's very clear that these are not topics that will be left out of the discussions. So let's turn our attention now to Yemen and the role that Saudi Arabia has played, because this is also an important issue that President Biden has talked about in terms of foreign policy and concern for the humanitarian devastation in Yemen, and the role that Saudi Arabia and other GCC countries have played in support of the UN recognized Yemeni government, but also the devastation from the bombing campaigns after so many years of war. We are looking, obviously, at a reassessment of what our assistance to Saudi Arabia should be in the context of the war. In the past, that included provision of precision-guided munitions, logistical support, and intelligence sharing. We know now that the Biden administration pledged and indeed has taken the step of putting military shipments on hold, and other assistance has been halted, except any assistance for Saudi Arabia's defense. In recent days, actually on Monday, the Saudi government, the foreign minister, has announced a proposed peace initiative and a ceasefire offer. One that was reiterated by the recognized Yemeni government on the 22nd of March, one which the Houthis have refused to date, stipulating A, that there really isn't anything new, but more importantly, B, that this can't even be considered until the Saudis lift the blockade on the key port of Hodeidah on the Red Sea. Yesterday, the Saudis cleared 4 fuel ships to dock at Hodeidah, presumably as a gesture of good faith. Now, is that gesture to the Houthis or to the US? I leave that to the audience to decide, but a gesture nonetheless. But it's clear that vast differences, based upon what the Houthis have said in reaction, some from Mohammed Abdeslam, who's a spokesperson for the Houthis, and others as well, that vast differences remain over the terms of a plan which includes the UN-supervised ceasefire, measures to reopen the airport in Sana'a, the capital, and lifting of the trade restrictions on all government-controlled ports, but in particular Hodeidah, which is the largest and the key port on the Red Sea. And we know that we have as a government, appointed a U.S. envoy on Yemen, Tim Lenderking, who's working with the UN envoy Martin Griffiths and other parties in the region, particularly the Omanis, who are key in terms of being trusted interlocutors with the Houthis, to the extent that the Houthis trust any interlocutors, and that these discussions will continue to be ongoing. But even if we stop the bombing campaign, and even if talks get started, there's the whole issue of the internal Yemeni civil war, and how do we really convince the Houthis to come to the negotiating table and negotiate in earnest? Now, I'm not going to go into the whole issue of whether the Houthis continue to take Ma'rib because that will give them a better negotiating positions, or could it also be an area where they don't do as well and therefore their position is going to get weakened? Obviously, that's a Houthi internal deliberation. But the fact that Ma'rib is the source of so much oil and revenue and fuel is going to be a very important consideration, even as the Houthis decide what makes sense. And does that have to go into how the Yemeni government thinks about approaching the Houthis? The Houthis have a seat at the table in terms of any kind of dialogue. And that was included in the GCC initiative and the national dialogue outcomes that really predate the Houthi takeover of Sana'a in September of 2014. But we have to look at the other issue of how does one control the various military elements across Yemen? How are these peace initiatives going to tie these factions together? How do you get the Southern Transitional Council to re-engage on a unified Yemen? Or will Yemen devolve into separate areas with more narrow transactional relations with neighbors? So the Houthis in Saudi Arabia in the north, UAE aligned with the STC in Aden. So these are all concerns. And then one last comment I'm going to make on Saudi domestic, and then I'll yield my time. The Biden administration has certainly put pressure on Saudi Arabia in terms of the report that the DNI has released on the Khashoggi killing and the sanctioning of individuals implicated in the operation, although for many people that wasn't enough because the Crown Prince was not included. But it's clear that the Biden administration is wrestling with the balance of regional security, commercial interests, human rights, looking for the art of the possible. That is how to make progress and get the country to respond. And in this case, by not challenging the structure of the economy. So we see Saudi Arabia taking a few small steps, in particular, releasing several Saudi activists, including Lujain al-Hathloul, and reducing the sentence for Ali and Nimr and others who, as a youth who was rounded up from demonstrations, youth under the age of 18 who was sentenced to death, and now that sentence has been dropped to a 10-year imprisonment. These are small steps that we see Saudi Arabia taking to buy time, to get on the right side of the Biden administration, but it's clear that there's still a lot of work to be done. And I'll leave the Qatar session to the question and answer. Thank you.
Ambassador Ziadi, thank you so much. One thought we will come to later in the question and answer section is you made a brief allusion to China in the Gulf, and just think about this as a question when we get to it. Is China to be viewed as a Cold War style existential competitor, or simply as a commercial competitor in the region, or something in between? Turning now to Dr. Hisham. Hisham, one important point that I think has come out in the discussion so far is Saudi Arabia clearly is the linchpin of the GCC. It is the largest, richest country in the region in gross terms. It is the market maker in the flow of crude oil still, despite changes in the market. It is a country whose population, I believe, exceeds that of all the other GCC countries put together, and who has in the past been seen as the spokesman for the GCC. Dr. Hisham, how does Riyadh see the changes in Washington?
Thank you. It's good to be with you, Ambassador, and my distinguished colleagues. So in answering how does Riyadh view Biden's foreign policy towards the kingdom, I'm not a diplomat, so I would say first that it's quite true that there is this, at least in the public perception, that the US is distancing itself from the kingdom. There is also this perception, right or wrong, that some members of the new team in the White House want to punish some of US allies in the region. I believe that there is what I call an American fatigue from the region that could push the US to expedite a loose nuclear deal with Iran sooner than later. On the other hand, we keep also hearing the other line of argument, which suggests that the Saudi-US relationship is unchangeable and relies on multiple constants, such as regional stability, economic development, security, and energy security, among other important elements. I would argue something in between, that the significance of the relationship between the US and the kingdom will probably mitigate the differences and disagreements between the two states. We have already seen signs along this path. As Dania mentioned earlier, actually it only took a month to prove such an assessment, as the Biden administration stressed that the aim was a recalibration of the relationship rather than a rupture. So in dealing with this understanding, the Saudis, at least in my opinion, are trying to be pragmatic in what they can achieve. They differentiate very well between what they want the region to be and what is possible at the current moment. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that there is no disagreements between the two parties, but rather that the strategic factors are more important in determining the strength of the partnership. And I think that this is not a new phenomenon. We have seen under multiple U.S. administrations that the U.S. has been de-emphasizing and doubting a close strategic partnership with the Saudis for some time now. And for legitimate reasons, such as the decline of the need of the Gulf oil, the U.S. exhaustion from regional conflict, and the real need to desire, American need to focus on China. The Biden administration will probably be more critical of the kingdom than previous administrations, and the Saudis, from their side, will adapt and change some policies on issues of difference. But there will be a limit for this adaptation. I could come later to this in the Q&A. Now, when it comes to the U.S. policy towards the kingdom, I do not think that there is a clear Biden-Saudi foreign policy until now. There is certainly a review of the military support to the kingdom, a focus on human rights. The administration in this regard began with the strongest card and finished with it, which is the intelligence report on the unfortunate and indefensible Khashoggi's killing. Finally, and most importantly, is the expected changes on dealing with Iran. And this is a complete package that includes the Yemen war, the U.S. willingness to resume dialogue with Iran, among many other issues. In short, the Saudis believe, for right reasons, in my opinion, that the worst that may impact the Saudi-American relationship would be probably in the short term. For the Americans, there is no equivalent or a regional alternative to Saudi. And in disagreement to wide assumptions, I would say that there is also a clear U.S. need for Saudi. The U.S. would find it difficult to end the war in Yemen, the civil war, as Ambassador Ziad mentioned, or even Libya, nor it can stabilize the Middle East without Saudi help. Additionally, Iran is not a threat only to Saudi, but also a threat to the U.S. presence and allies in the whole region. Also, with the opening, this is a new factor, with the opening of the Saudi economy and the country in general, the relationship will go beyond the energy and security parameters. Trade and investments is expected to increase in size and volume and number of sectors also. Now, on the so-called, and this is related to your to the excellent point you mentioned, Ambassador, the so-called Saudi pivot to Asia. And I think that this is very important to analyze and discuss, as it influenced to a great extent the recalibration of relationships. It's true that the Saudi is in need for US to assist in defending its security. However, the US also need the kingdom and the rest of the Gulf states, while the US is no longer in need for the GCC oil. The US allies and foes are reliant on it. Japan and China have respectively imported 80% and 40%, I think, of their need from oil from the GCC. Add to this fact that the US commitment to the region is not as it was. Saudi and other Gulf states, for that matter, are now seeking to further internationalize their security. It's not that they want to replace the US as the main security partner or guarantor, and this is not possible, at least in the foreseeable future. But definitely, these states want more international involvement, specifically in the protection of the Gulf. In this context, we are seeing a qualitative improvement in working with China, Russia, Japan, India, and also South Korea, which all have vested interest in Gulf security. However, it's vitally important to note that such intensification of cooperation, if I may call it, especially with China and other Asian countries, has less to do with the US and more with the ongoing shift in geopolitics and the eastward movement of the global economic center of gravity, thus bringing Asia and the Middle East as a whole closer together. So now, and taking all these factors into consideration, what would a recalibrated US-Saudi relationship under Biden look like? The most important aspect of this recalibration should be the view and position towards Iran. At least this is what concerns the Saudis most. And if anything is lost from the Trump era for the Saudis, it would be probably the continuation of sanctions, economic sanctions in Iran, which were never sufficient. And having sanctions with no goal in sight have caused the chaos we saw in recent years. And if I speak directly about the Saudi view, also on the resumption of dialogue with Iran, Riyadh still believe that the US is keen not to lose Saudi as an ally or a partner, especially with the increase of cooperation with China and Russia from the Saudi side, specifically China and the trade side. But I emphasize and reiterate that the relationship between Saudi and both Russia and China is not threatening to the US-Saudi partnership, at least in this current phase of history. It's still a seller and buyer relationship with China. And in regard to cooperating with Russia, Russia have no skin in the game. This is at least how I see it. And the Saudis differ greatly in opinion and politics with Russia. The cooperation is limited to stabilizing the markets, as both are oil exporters that have really nothing to trade on a large scale from each other. Add to this fact that the Saudi financial tools and instruments are very Western in nature. We know that economic cooperation wouldn't be something easy to achieve now or even in the foreseeable future. So in short, while the Saudi-US partnership under Biden may not enjoy the same personal connection it enjoyed with Trump, it's safe to assume that it would remain an important and strategic one on an institutional and state-to-state basis. In other words, while Biden emphasized the support for democratic values and the conduct of his foreign policy, the answer to whether he would sacrifice a strategic relationship with an important regional heavyweight such as Saudi for the differences in value systems is almost certainly no. Riyadh, from its side, is also committed to strengthening its relationship with the US, despite the apparent divergent policies when it comes, especially with dealing with Iran. I think I'm out of time, so I will conclude. So the way forward, at the current moment and also the near future, I expect the Saudis will work with the Americans closely and on all fronts. However, the kingdom have to face realities, the changing international regional context by expanding relations with other main and middle powers to ensure that any US gap or void is properly filled by the necessary strategic deterrence. The US will rearrange its military presence. This is expected. New security arrangements will likely emerge for the region, in which Saudi will play an important and vital role. So in my opinion, Riyadh should not view Biden approach as a threat, but as an opportunity to move forward and building a stronger and more sustainable strategic partnership. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hisham. Stephen, this leaves you as the cleanup batter. Bases are loaded. What does Washington really have in mind in the Gulf? You got to unmute.
Pandemic living. I always forget to unmute. First of all, thank you so much, Patrick. I very much appreciate the invitation to take part in another Gulf International Forum event. It's great to be back. I want to promise, despite Patrick's reference to bases loaded, I promise everybody I will not use American sports metaphors in anything that I have to say, recognizing I might be speaking to a more international audience than we would have if we were just in a conference room in Washington, D.C. It's also, I just want to say before I begin, it's a great pleasure to be on the virtual dais with Ambassador Ziada, Dr. Danya Thafar, and Dr. Hisham Alghannam. It's very much a pleasure. And it's also great for me to go last because I can take all of the wise things that you said, roll them up and make them my own, and everybody will remember the last guy who spoke. So thank you for doing all that hard work for me. The two questions that Patrick posed to me were, have U.S.-Saudi relations changed under Biden? If so, how? And the second one, how do you expect relations to continue under the Biden administration? In some ways, this is kind of a funny question. President Biden hasn't been in office for much more than 60 days. The kind of traditional reviews of policies that both Ambassador Theros and Ambassador Ziada are well acquainted with generally run for quite a few more months through June. But nevertheless, there has been some action on the front, on the Gulf front, and particularly with regard to Saudi Arabia. And I think that those actions, I think, render the answer to the question as fairly self-evident. And let me just review in a very clear way what the Biden administration has done with regard to U.S.-Saudi relations since the president took the oath of office, as I said, a little more than 60 days ago. First, they placed arms sales under review. Now, this is routine, but in this case, it's not going to be routinely released. There is a genuine review of weaponry and how it is being used, particularly as it relates to Yemen. This is something that is not just a quirk of the Biden administration. There is real bipartisan support for a change in the security relationship with Saudi Arabia, specifically as it relates to Yemen. The second thing that the administration did was it appointed an envoy to try to help end the conflict in Yemen. And I think that Ambassador Ziada was quite correct in pointing out that this is actually a civil conflict in Yemen among different groups in Yemen that the Saudis intervened in. This is not a conflict that was caused by Saudi Arabia, and that Saudi Arabia actually has significant and legitimate security concerns given the conflict in Yemen. But nevertheless, there are significant questions about Saudi Arabia's conduct in its intervention. And that's why we have both the envoy as well as the hold on weapons, which I suspect that the ones that can be used in an offensive manner will not be released to Saudi Arabia. The third thing that President Biden did was declare that he would only speak to the king. He would not speak to the crown prince, and that the crown prince's interlocutor would be the Secretary of Defense. This seems appropriate given lines of responsibility, but nevertheless, it is a change from the previous administration. The fourth thing that they did was, as we all know, they released a report on what the U.S. intelligence community knew and continues to know about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and then applied sanctions on individuals that were deemed responsible for the murder. And then fifth, and something that I think is very, very important, and I think is a good step forward, they instituted what is called the Khashoggi ban, which allows the State Department to ban people from the United States who are harassing or threatening dissidents and journalists. This is something that Saudi Arabia has been doing over recent years. They've been getting away with it, and it's deeply problematic on a number of levels. So this is something I think that is an important change, but it's also not just a change with regard to U.S.-Saudi relations. The Khashoggi ban will apply globally. Chinese who are harassing dissidents or journalists, Russians, Turks, whoever it may be, they will be. There's the possibility that they will be banned from the United States. I think it's a good step forward, and I think it does speak to this emphasis on values that the Biden administration would like to continue to emphasize. The fact, obviously, that the administration did not take action against the Crown Prince directly, as again, Ambassador Ziada pointed out, disappointed many people. But foreign policy really is choosing between a lot of bad options. And it's clear that when President Biden or his spokespeople call recalibrating, genuinely means recalibrating the relationship. Recalibrating has a specific meaning. And it means taking action where appropriate and feasible to hold the Saudis accountable, or to message to the Saudis that we disapprove of something that they've done while preserving the overall relationship, because as Dr. Hisham pointed out, it is a very, very important relationship. The administration clearly understands that preserving the relationship with Saudi Arabia and having a constructive working relationship with Saudi Arabia makes it relatively easier for the United States to pursue its goals in the region than without them. And those goals include primarily a renewed negotiation with Iran, ending the suffering in Yemen. Those are both clearly connected to Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabia's regional rivalry and at times conflict with Iran, and widening the circle of peace in the region, which no one has really touched on so directly, but I think it is part of what the administration would like to do. And I think that Saudis have this kind of fulsome view that, the United States can't do anything in the region without Saudi Arabia. I hear that from my Egyptian friends as well. But I think if you really narrow it down to what the United States wants to do, it's really those three things that I pointed out. Now, the question is, will this continue? Will the administration continue to highlight the values issue as it goes forward? And I think it's clear from what Dr. Hisham said. I think it's clear from what other Saudis, whether officials or not, have said. I think it's clear from most people that we would speak to in the region about these issues is that they remain, they are not convinced that the Biden administration's early emphasis on values is going to be something that the administration continues over a long period of time. The sense that whatever action the administration was going to take against Saudi Arabia was going to be front-loaded. It was going to take place within the first 60 days, and then we would move on and we'd go back to some sort of business as usual. And I think there's, the argument that this was something about a campaign and that it was, President Biden responding to pressure from wings of actually both the Republican and Democratic Party to take action against Saudi Arabia. I think that there is certainly something to that, and there's certainly something to the idea that the Saudis, that the administration would like to preserve a working relationship with Saudi Arabia. And of course, there's been a pattern in U.S. foreign policy to talk about our values, but then when it came to reconciling our values with our interests, we have had a very, very hard time doing that, and interests tend to win out. So I think that that's really why people have reason to be skeptical of this kind of values-forward policy that President Biden and his team have so far pursued. But at the same time, there's reason to believe that even if they don't pursue a values-forward foreign policy, that these relationships and the relationship with Saudi Arabia is going to continue to change. Saudi Arabia, the relationship with Egypt, the relationship with Jordan, the relationship with the United Arab Emirates, the relationship with Qatar, that kind of regional coalition that made it relatively easier and less expensive for the United States to pursue its interests in the region. These relationships are largely anachronisms. They made sense 20 years ago, 25 years ago, 40 years ago, but it's not at all clear that they make as much sense today as they did all those decades ago. And this is something that Dr. Danya referred to in kind of that this paradigm in which we have been living, particularly since, let's say, 1991, but even before that and up through the American invasion of Iraq, that these relationships served a certain purpose and we're looking for another purpose. So that's a kind of tantalizing thing, and I think people recognize this. I think it's not necessarily been manifested in any policy, but I think there's an implicit understanding that the world really has turned, and that there's likely to be change in the off. And that comes at the same time that there is an actual conversation underway in Washington about how to reduce the American commitment to the region. There's been no definitive answer to those questions, but as these questions come, as this conversation continues, questions are surfaced about, well, do we really need Saudi Arabia? In what ways do we need Saudi Arabia? Why should we have this strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia? What do the energy markets and what does energy, the never-ending quest for energy independence say about our relationship? What does the decarbonization of economies say about our future relationship with Saudi Arabia? And so I think that just as the kind of changes and the difference between the way in which President Biden versus the way his predecessor approached Saudi Arabia, in addition to the way in all of these conversations are happening in Washington, it provides the administration with more leeway to emphasize issues like values, like human rights. And so it may not just be a fleeting first 60 days type of policy, but the fact of the matter is, and this is going to be very, very unsatisfying to anybody who's listening, we're really just going to have to wait and see. If, however, the Saudis are convinced that this is something that is just an early part of the administration, they may be surprised, and we may end up having a more conflictual relationship than they suspect. I'll stop there because I'm getting the hint that I should stop, and I look forward to Q&A. Thanks so much.
There, I got to unmute too. Stephen, thank you very much. I'd like to pick up on towards the end of your comments about relooking our commitment to the region, and maybe we want to lessen it. One of the themes that the punditry in Washington has never stopped talking about in the last couple of years has been the American people's exhaustion with the endless wars. Leaving Afghanistan aside, which seems to be the focus of that conversation, is there really an exhaustion? Do the American people really want us to pull out? Is there the Trump administration seemed to be reviving an isolationist trend or philosophy in American foreign policy? Was that real? Does that really have popular resonance? Or is it something that is confined mostly to the punditry in Washington? Any volunteers?
I think it's an interesting question, Patrick, and I think the answer is yes and no. I think the yes part is that if you look at polls on specific issues, polls on Syria, doing more in Syria, there's very, very little support for the United States to do more in Syria. The American people elected 2 presidents in a row who part of their platforms was reducing the U.S. presence in the Middle East. Now, of course, American presidents are not elected because of their Middle East policies, but nevertheless, the logic, one of the logics of President Obama's run for the White House in 2008 was that we had overcommitted around the world, but in particular in the Middle East. President Trump took that up, and he used the term "ending endless wars." But I think there's also evidence that if people like me and others were to explain better what's at stake in the Middle East and why what the United States is doing in the Middle East, obviously, recognizing some of the fundamental mistakes that the United States made over the course of the last 20 years, that the American people would understand. And you wouldn't have a groundswell of people who say, come home, America. So I think that, as I said, I think it's yes and no. I think in this kind of drift of the last however many years, Americans have wondered what we're doing. I play this game when I give talks around the United States, when I was able to give talks around the United States, where I ask people, before we get to the Q&A, I ask audience of all sizes, who wants to do more in the Middle East? Who wants to do more in Syria? Very, 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 very small number of people. Now, that's not scientific, that's anecdotal, but you can put that up with polling that's been done. And I'm happy to provide polling that shows that pretty much Americans kind of tired of the Middle East unless someone came up with a good explanation as to why we should be there. And I think there is a case to be made, and we should be making that case.
Thank you, Stephen. Ambassador Ziadi, anyone else on that subject?
If you want, I can chime in.
Yes, please.
I mean, my gathering is if you look on the ultra-right, the ultra-left, and even the centrist rhetoric about going to war, I think there's a tendency, especially in campaigning, to say that we want to end all these endless wars. And there's just this general understanding about how these wars are so costly to the U.S. and whatnot. And then there's a question about intervening. And intervening, there's a variation in what's considered intervention. For example, is what happened in Libya is a form of intervention. What happened in Iraq is a major form of intervention and a regime change intervention. And so I think what you see the public really raise concern about is Iraq and Afghanistan. And most of the public, that's kind of their awareness of what's going on in the Middle East. And there is a high level of criticism about the policy, what happened in Syria. And there's a lot of criticism about Obama not reacting enough. Yet there's a lot of criticism of the US intervening a lot. So it's kind of like damned if you do, damned if you don't sort of situation. And so narrowly defining what intervention is, what it entails, how long it should be, and what are the costs. And as I mentioned, when I talked about the calculus for national security interest, human security needs to be part of that question, because whatever happens in the region, as we know, we are a global interdependent community, and it affects national security interests in the West. I won't go on anymore, but I have a lot more to say about that. But I think I'll stop right here.
Same time, Dr. Hisham, you raised an issue very briefly about Saudi Arabia's relationship with China, and I would like to explore that a bit more. Last year, before the entire world got shut down, I had begun to develop a relationship with China, with a major Chinese think tank at Peking University, in which they essentially, I came away with two impressions. One was a Chinese fear that the United States was moving towards a Cold War relationship like we had with the Soviet Union, and that anything they would do in the Middle East, anything they would do in the Gulf would be regarded as a threat, just as the way we regarded the Soviets in their time. And the other impression that I came away with was the Chinese may be getting involved commercially in the region, but they frankly know very little about it. So what my question for you was, how does the kingdom view China? Does it view China simply as a lucrative and prosperous client and customer? Is it a counterbalance to American actions? Are there things that Chinese are doing that the kingdom is unhappy with?
Okay. I'll answer this, and I will link it also to the intervention concept earlier. Still, China, the relationship with Saudi and Chinese relationship is a seller and a buyer relationship. No, the Saudis do not think that they can counterbalance the US with China or Russia. Having said this, there were major disagreements with Trump because of this intervention of this American fatigue from the region and American willingness to disengage. There were big areas of disagreement with Trump on this. Trump did not seem to have an appreciation of the strategic importance of the partnership with Saudi. He also lacked, in my opinion, a strategic vision, and the relationship was almost reduced to financial transactions. Also, in the eyes of many, and I think this is crucial, there was no response to Iran attack on Abqaiq. And let me also say that there is a great burden on Saudi. A major part of the issue is that Iran continuous association of Saudi as an ally of the US, which has been very problematic. That association resulted in Iran attacking Saudi several times, attacking crucial Saudi infrastructure. 7 million barrels go through Abqaiq alone, thereby undermining Saudi economy security and the global economy for that matter. There was no response to this attack till now. Iran also has used this association in attacking the political security of Saudi Arabia. So there is a burden on Saudi, a great burden. So when Saudi looks east or for any other power, there is this attempt to create this mosaic of strategic deterrence, and for legitimate reasons. The current arrangement in the region is not sustainable. That's why there was this also perception that the US has given Iran the green card to continue its activities using proxies such as Houthi in Yemen and Hezbollah in Lebanon. This is not what we want from the US. I believe, as you rightly mentioned, a holistic approach is needed. The Saudis want a responsible American, not a security contractor. And the only state in the world that could provide this is America at the current moment. Neither Russia or China can do that. Also a complete solution to the Iranian issue is needed. We have no problem with the Iranian people, and what happens inside Iran concerns the Iranian people. But what we want is to stop these attacks on our borders, especially from the Houthis. the official line of talk would say that we want the legitimate government to be back in Yemen. And I think the most important issue is that we have rockets firing at us from Yemen. We need to end this by any means possible.
Thank you, Dr. Hisham. One country that we've only mentioned in passing, and yet the militarily second most important, strategically most powerful country in the region is the United Arab Emirates. And what of particular interest to me has been for the first time a major extension by a GCC country out of its area. The Emirates is now so engaged in the Eastern Mediterranean, whether it is engaged in the civil war in Libya, whether it is Emirati aircraft flying joint exercises with a NATO member, Greece. This, to me, is certainly unprecedented, and I'm wondering how do we see this in Washington? What do you, why is it important to us? Is it good for us? Is it bad for us? Ambassador Ziadi, let me hit you with that one.
While I'm not an expert in the UAE per se, I would say the following. I personally have always looked at the issue of the UAE and its machinations in the whether it's in Libya or the Eastern Med as a way of not only asserting its presence regionally, but asserting its understanding of what regional countries should look like, how the actors should conduct themselves. And this all goes back to the identity of the region. Is it an Arab region? Is it a national region with its own specific identities? Is it an Islamic region? And the whole issue of political Islam in part does drive how the Emirates look at some of these issues. Now, it can be tied to, for example, in the Eastern Med, the issue of natural gas, but it's also part of how you shore up Greece and other countries against Turkey, because the encroachment of Turkey is an anathema to the UAE, not only in political terms, but in ideological terms of political Islam. The same thing can be said in terms of Libya. You see the UAE's partnership with Israel as it has signed the Abraham Accords and has moved most expeditiously in trying to set up relations, not only in medicine and technology, but also in areas of arms and in particular in trade. And in this context, whether it's the Dubai port world developing the Haifa port or looking at a pipeline between Israel and the UAE through Saudi Arabia, this is all tied to natural gas. So the UAE you have to look at it like a prism. There are many different cuts to how the UAE assesses its strategic interests, and it's not surprising. And I'll just end on the fact that while it's not part of this discussion, looking at the whole Horn of Africa is indeed another issue for the UAE.
And kicking off from that, for Stephen, you've spent a great deal of time on Turkish issues and so forth. Is Turkey a major? Turkey is apparently trying to be a major player in the region. Where do you see Turkey going in the region? Is there a chance that it might align itself with Iran? Just where is, I mean, this is, the Turks were last in the region in the 1860s. Are they back, or is it just a little bit of show?
Well, it's a great question. I think they're back in some places, not in others, and where they're back, their record is mixed, to say the least. I think that just starting with what Ambassador Ziad said, there was a lot of focus and emphasis after the signing of the Abraham Accords that this was kind of coming out more public, a public acknowledgement of a regional coalition that was focused on Iran. But I think it's important to recognize it was as much as it was focused on Iran, it was also focused on Turkey. And this is a function of the fact that Turkey is now seen as an actor in the region that is not supportive of the regional status quo that is a benefit to countries like the United Arab Emirates, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and by extension, a variety of others. And that's why you see the Emiratis in the Eastern Mediterranean. That's why you see the Emirati Air Force exercising with the Hellenic Air Force off of Crete. The same thing, by the way, most recently with Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Air Force at Suda Bay as well. So there's clearly a sense that Turkey, within Turkey and within the leadership of Turkey, that its rightful place is a leader of the region, is a leader of the Muslim world. That's the way, kind of in an ideological way, a self-regarding ideological way. That is of concern to the major countries of the region. And then, of course, there's the relationship between Turkey and Qatar, which until recently was seen, at least in Riyadh, as a cause for concern, although the Saudis and the Qataris seem to have buried the hatchet. But among the other blockading states, I think there's still concern about both the Qataris as well as Turkey. I think that it's odd to believe that the Turks would align with Iran in the major regional conflict. I think that the Turks view Iran as both a competitor as well as an opportunity. It's an opportunity to do business. It's an opportunity to cooperate on specific kinds of issues like Kurds, but it's also a competitor. Let me just say that I don't buy the argument that Turkish leaders and Iranian leaders kind of look at their history of conflict between Ottoman empires and the Safavids and decide that they're going to be conflictual. I think that they calculate their interests according to the situation in which they find themselves. And that means at times strategic cooperation and at times strategic competitors. I don't have to remind people that Turkey facilitated Iran's ability to evade sanctions. But they nevertheless find themselves on opposite ends of a very important regional conflict in Syria. So they've been able to compartmentalize their relations, work together. I don't think that the Turks line up either with the anti-Iran faction nor with the Iranians in this regional power rivalry.
Can I,
Dr. Hisham, yes, please.
Yeah, I just want to a really quick comment on what Stephen said about Turkey, and I agree with most of what he said. Turkey, for the Saudis, Turkey is an important regional player and a very vital country in the Islamic world. But it should not use the cover of Sunni Islam or even the US cover to extend its influence. The Saudi understand the Turkish presence, for instance, in northern Iraq and northern Syria, but not elsewhere. Not in the Gulf and not in Libya. Both Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, it's not only Saudi, are concerned about Turkey now past growing engagement in Libya, which includes deployment of Syrian mercenaries to Libya. But I think in the long run, the relationship will be improving with Turkey, not the opposite, especially in the coming years. I think the worst, we have seen the worst in the relationship and things will improve. And at least the Saudi, Turkey, also Egyptian angle, we will see an improvement. This is what I believe. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hisham. We've talked sort of externally about Iran, but one question that has always intrigued me is we've said that the elections could or could not be a deadline for restoring the JCPOA. My question, and this is a personal question, not from the audience, is why would the hardliners not want to return to the status quo? What do they see as advantageous to continuing the current status quo with the Americans of very heavy sanctions, real damage to the Iranian economy, damage that they've stood up to, but nonetheless unnecessary if it could be solved simply by getting their signature back, getting the Americans back into the JCPOA. Why would the hardliners oppose it? Any thoughts? Hello? Dr. Hisham?
I think I have a short answer. Yani, for mainly domestic reasons, there is no rationale behind opposing going back to status quo other than domestic competition in Iran itself.
There was from one of the from the question again. Is the United States really concerned about China in the region? Is it truly a peer competitor? Are we reverting to the Cold War, or is it simply something for the punditry? Dr. Ambassador Ziadeh?
Well, I think China is trying to expand in the region and would like to do more. There's no question. Currently, it's more economic and commercial, certainly through their ports, their bases in parts of the region, their brick and road initiative. They are trying to sell more in the area of arms, but they haven't been as successful as they would like to be. And I'm not sure that they're going to be successful in the short run, although in the long run, that is possible. But one thing I would like to point to, if I may, if we have just one moment, is the issue of energy and the linkage to China. It's true that we are more self-reliant on energy in the United States, but we have a huge trade with China. And that trade is in goods, and those goods are produced through dint of the importation of oil from the region. So while the oil and natural gas may not be coming directly to the United States, and right now it's at about 1 million barrels per day coming to the US, mostly from Saudi, the fact is that because of the global economy and the supply chains, and how the economy works, even our manufacturing base, the issue of oil supply to China does affect us dramatically. So we do have a keen interest in the production, pricing, supply, and free flow of energy from the region.
Well, we've come pretty much to the end of our time. Before we actually, Dr. Hisham? Did you have a question?
I think we covered China extensively, but I think we should also speak about Russia. There was no American position towards Russia, increased presence and interference in the region in the past years. Russia have been interested to have a clear presence in the Red Sea. It made an agreement with Sudan to establish a Navy base, which I believe can hold a Russian nuclear ship. Nobody's talking about this. But now, both Russia and the Gulf have an interest in security of the Red Sea. So many players are trying to intervene in the region. The US, is not doing anything about this, and despite the Russian need for the Gulf and the Kingdom, the Russians are not making any concessions in any of the files that worries the Saudis, for instance. And I think this what recalibrating the whole relationship should entails. A clear US presence in the region with let's say new terms. But if you leave the region and try to withdraw from it, don't expect that the Russians and the Chinese would not increase their presence. Whether if it's on the trade and business side. Or any other presence, especially the military presence.
Dr. Hisham, go ahead, I'm sorry.
If I may?
Yes.
Talking about China's role in the Gulf, I frankly don't believe that China wants to replace the U.S. role in the Gulf. And China definitely doesn't want to assert any sort of security role in the region. And if you look historically, China has been very bothered by the disruptions and in the oil markets from tensions in the region. And they have to kind of make up for that disruption with other players. So they want to be on good terms with everyone. So asserting their power in the region is not really something that they're very keen about. I think that their relations are primarily commercial. And I think this is a weak point for the US. I think the US needs to take away that image of just having boots on the ground, and also look at increasing its influence through economic means. Although there is still a strong economic means, is still, if you ask anyone in the Gulf, how do you envision American? You're gonna they think of a soldier with boots on the ground. And how do you envision a Chinese? Is a man in a suit with a contract ready to sign it. So I think that's something that should be considered. That's it.
Thank you. We've really outrun our time. Dr. Hisham, by the way, must have been reading my mind, because my last question to each of you is if you could, within a minute, and I'm excusing Dr. Hisham from this requirement, is there something we haven't covered that we should worry about? And if you could do this in a minute. Ambassador Ziadi.
Certainly the transnational issues of climate change linked to health issues, that's particularly keen, not only in terms of the rising sea, but how it affects the living environment for people there. So I think the fact that we as an administration should focus on that is important.
Dr. Danya. Hello? Unmute.
Oh, muted again. Okay. I think, and I've mentioned that so many times, the issue of human security and redefining national security issues. I mean, even the refugee crisis that's happening and affecting the international community, terrorism, all of these are rooted in human security issues. And I think they're not emphasized enough when it comes to the region. The GCC states do have a role in that with regards to all the conflicts and the proxy wars going on. And I think that this is something that the US should be addressing more holistically and address some of the root causes that affect its national security interest, rather than just looking at military issues when it comes to the region.
Stephen, you're all set up now. What have we missed?
Well, first, I just want to endorse what Ambassador Ziada said on this question of climate change and global health. In fact, it's part of a book that I'm writing right now, so I'm glad that I feel confirmed that the ambassador said that. But I think more importantly, and immediately on this question of American role in the region, I would hate for the United States to get carried away with this ending endless war thing, where we have swung 180 degrees from one extreme to another, where we believe we can transform the region to believing that we have no real business in the region. I think U.S. Middle East policy needs to evolve, but I think to leave the region is to ask for considerable problems going forward, whether it's on the level of great power competition. I want to say that I agree with Dr. Danya about this issue of China, but we may create our own problems by acting heedlessly. So I think that the United States can play a constructive role and move away from these bad last 2 decades where people in the region only think of U.S. soldiers, to a more constructive role. And then we actually won't really have to worry about the Russians or the Chinese, because everybody wants us to be there. No one really wants the Chinese and the Russians. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. I don't think the Chinese and the Russians want us to leave either, for that matter. But on a sort of my last note, a friend of mine said, talking about withdrawal from the region and getting, as the last American airplane leaves carrying the last American soldier, they better have a return ticket already written, because that's what will happen. I would like to thank all of you. This has been
or something other than a soldier.
Right. Thank you so much all for participating. Thank you to our audience, and see you again.
Did Dr. make his closing point?
Yes.
He did? Oh.
Yeah. Dr. Hisham actually set the stage for the closing point.
Okay. Sorry. I zoned out.
Okay. Thank you so much. And it's a good night to all.